What's up, folks? So I'm going to try and make this a quick video today so that y'all don't have to spend a whole lot of time sitting around listening to me blab on about the Civil War. So anyway, let's get to rolling with this. So the essential question for today: what were the major events of the early years of the Civil War from 1861 to 1863? Why was the South winning during the early years of the war, and how did the North plan to retake the South? So we talk about these earlier portions of the Civil War, basically the first half, because during that time period, the Confederacy is winning most of the battles. And it's in 1863, really after the Battle of Antietam, that we see the shift go from the Confederacy winning these big battles to the Union then winning and eventually the closure of the Civil War. But anyway, we'll get to that in the next PowerPoint lesson. But today we're just going to talk about the Civil War and its beginnings. So there's all your vocab. I'm not going to go over that with you here. We'll just talk about it as we go through the PowerPoint itself. So Lee's elected in 1860, and we know already the Deep South, these 7 southern states down here, secede from the Union and form the Confederate States of America, a completely independent, separately operating country. This is no longer the United States down here. This is the Confederate States of America. So these are essentially 2 completely different countries, and I just want you to keep that in your head. Also, as a result, the Deep South has already seceded, but as a result of Fort Sumter being fired upon, the rest of the South, the Upper South, will then secede with the rest of it and join up with the Confederate States. And then, of course, these border states, as we talked about already, will remain in the Union, either forcibly or voluntarily, remain within the Union. And so there you have it, the Confederacy as it exists at that point in time, and then up here, this is the Union. This is all the United States, all the territory and states that are owned by it. So the Union has to come up with a strategy quickly to try and quell what Lincoln sees as just a rebellion. He doesn't think this is going to be a very long-lasting war between these 2 independently operating countries. He thinks that it's just the southern states in a bit of rebellion, and so they want to get that nipped in the bud real quick. And the main way that they intend to do it is this thing called the Anaconda Plan. That is their strategy for ensuring a Union victory during the Civil War. So essentially, it's a multi-part plan. First off, the thing the Union wants to do is blockade the coast. When the South secedes, the U.S. Navy doesn't go with it. The Navy stays mostly aligned with the United States of America. So they have access to this huge amount of naval power, and they use that power to blockade the South. Well, why would they do that? Because it is horrendously detrimental to the Southern economy. Because keep in mind, they're growing cotton, but now they're not selling it to the northern portion of the U.S. anymore. Now they have to rely on foreign trade. And so if the United States is able to blockade the South and stop them from being able to ship their cotton out from the Confederate States off to Britain or off to France where that's being received, then the Confederacy is basically making no money. They're growing cotton, but they're not making any money off of it. Also, they want to take this over here, the Mississippi River. They want to take control of that and essentially cut off portions of the Confederate States from each other. It would essentially cut the Confederacy in half. And they intend to do that by seizing both the North with Ulysses S. Grant and seizing the South with the U.S. Navy, and then steadily working their way up and working their way down, seizing the entirety of the Mississippi River, a big, big trade route for those southern states, or I'm sorry, the Confederate States at this point. And then eventually take the capital of Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederate States. And like an anaconda would, it's not a venomous snake, it's a snake that squeezes its prey to death until it can't survive anymore. And that's what the U.S. wants to do, completely surround the Confederacy and then steadily work their way in and essentially just squeeze them to death, starve them out so that they won't fight that war anymore because they won't have the resources to do so. So, exploit South's dependency on foreign trade and its inability to manufacture weapons. If they're not trading with anyone, they're not building up those supplies that they may be losing during the war. The loss of weapons, the loss of machinery, the loss of life, and also the loss of money as well. They're not trading with these other foreign powers, means they're not making any money. Also, the North is really going to rely heavily on their advantages, the population that they have going on up there. They have many more people, as you can see right here, 71% as opposed to the 29% down in the Confederacy. Their industry is a lot higher as well. They're producing more industrial goods, and they can make them at a faster and a more mass rate. And lastly, a better military just in general. Not in terms of commanders, but just a better and larger military that they have access to. So, big names within this. George McClellan, he is in charge of what's called the Army of the Potomac, and he's going to be off in the eastern theater of the United States. The Eastern theater being the eastern portion of the U.S. and the fighting that's going on over there around Maryland, D.C., Pennsylvania, and within Virginia as well. So George McClellan, he's fighting for the United States of America. And then you have Ulysses S. Grant, who is going to be fighting off in the West for the United States as well. He's going to be fighting in like Kentucky and Tennessee and trying to seize the northernmost portions of the Mississippi River so they can then move further down south and gain the rest of it. So how does the Confederacy intend to win this war? So the South doesn't have to go into the North really at all unless an opportunity presents itself for them to do so, and to do so safely and inflict damage upon the North. But all they really have to do, and we talked about this already, is fight a defensive war. They can stay within the South, and whenever the North gets involved within the southern states, they can then attack back. They can defend themselves. But really all they have to do is just kind of wait the North out and defend against what's called northern aggression. The North kind of coming down into the southern states and trying to enforce their will upon those southern states. And also they have a huge intention of getting Britain and France involved as well, because they felt that Britain especially was dependent upon that cotton export that they were receiving from the Confederacy. And if the North is blockading them, then the British are no longer receiving those cotton-based goods. And so Britain will have to come to the South's aid, and France will as well. They're really dependent upon that, and it looked almost like Britain and France were going to assist the South. However, there is a change in that plan after the Battle of Antietam, which we'll talk about in just a second. Also, the South just intends to drag this war out as long as possible. They want this to be a long-lasting war because they know the longer it takes, the more demoralized the North is going to be. The longer this war drags out, the less the North is going to support it and just go, you know what, why are we even fighting this war? If the South doesn't want to be here, if they don't want to be a part of the United States anymore, just let them go. We're losing people, we're losing lives, we're losing money. It's just not worth it to continue to fight. Robert E. Lee, probably one of the most significant Confederate generals during the war, and really one of the only ones that we're going to talk about. He's in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate military over here right around Richmond in the northern portion of Virginia. And he's going to be in some of the biggest and most successful battles within the Civil War that the Confederacy is going to win, because he was such a brilliant military strategist. Unlike a lot of the northern generals, he's a well-experienced man. He's fought in previous battles and previous wars before, and so he's going to have maybe not the manpower and maybe not the technology that the North necessarily does, but he is going to have the experience and the ability to maneuver his troops in such a way that they could pull out a victory when they should not have. So how does Lincoln respond? So Lincoln is going to have to do something called using his emergency powers, and his intention in doing this is to make sure that the United States is safe. Essentially what an emergency power is that it's an executive order that is able to be enforced because of the emergency status within the United States. There's a threat to the U.S., the United States of America, and therefore, in order to get things moving quickly, the president has the ability to enforce his will or enforce whatever is best for the United States without congressional approval. And so how he does that, or what he does specifically, is first off, he suspends habeas corpus, which is laws requiring evidence before citizens can be jailed. So he can essentially jail any sort of individuals who are important or may be involved with the Confederate States in order to ensure the protection of the United States of America. And also he closes down any newspapers that did not support the war, which is going to be a direct infringement upon the First Amendment, but it's in order to protect the United States, so he feels that he can do that during this wartime. So what is Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, going to do during this time? Well, he actually has a lot less power than Lincoln does because, once again, this is a confederacy. It's a confederation of states, and states have the ultimate power. So really all that Jefferson Davis can do is ask individual states to send money or to send troops to the federal government to help protect it during this wartime. And as a result of that, most governors are going to respond by not sending any, or sending very few, or sending very little money, or sending none at all. And that's going to cause a lot of problems for the Confederacy and their ability to win that war, especially in the long run, because the states refuse to send the goods that are needed to win this war. War's expensive, and states don't want to bear that burden to pay for it. especially those that aren't directly involved in the fighting, such as like Texas. Why would Texas want to be involved in sending money and troops when that fighting's really happening so far away? Also, there's going to be a huge amount of inflation within the Confederate States in terms of their currency, basically making it almost completely worthless. So the national government, the U.S. and the Confederate States initially want volunteer armies. They rely heavily on volunteer armies, people volunteering to join within the U.S. military or the CSA military. However, after a while, that's not enough. And so the USA is going to enforce a draft, meaning if you are a male U.S. citizen during this time period, you are forced to be and enlist within the U.S. military in order to supply the troops that are necessary. And as a result of that, there's actually going to be a huge amount of riots, one of the largest one happening in New York as a result of the draft, because people don't want to be forced to fight in a war that they don't necessarily believe in, or just generally don't want to fight it in the first place because they're afraid for their own lives, because there is such a heavy loss of life during this war. So, initially the Confederacy is winning, mostly because of that defensive strategy, and also because the Southern generals like Robert E. Lee and like Stonewall Jackson are just so adept in leading their men, and also because of disagreements among the military and the political leaders of the North. It wasn't 100% of the North was 100% for the war. In fact, it was very, very fractured in the North in terms of who did support the war, who didn't, why you supported it, whether you wanted to fight in it, whether you wanted it to go on, whether you wanted it to stop. It was a very, very fractured and very most violent political scene going on within the northern states. So, just to talk about some of the battles that occurred very quickly. So the first real battle of the Civil War is Bull Run, also known as First Manassas, happening in 1861, and that is going to be a Confederate victory. Next up, a U.S. victory at the Battle of Shiloh, where Grant seizes the northernmost portion of the Mississippi for the United States. Also a U.S. victory down in New Orleans, seizing the southernmost portion of the United States, once again working to get that Anaconda Plan fulfilled. There's the Battle of Seven Pines, the 7 Days Battle, the Second Battle of Bull Run. All of these are Confederate state victories as well over these three up here in the red. So the Confederacy is going to win initially these big victories here, though this off in the Western theater is going to be huge for the United States, fulfilling that portion of the Anaconda Plan. So the Confederacy is really going to be successful off in the East, whereas the United States is going to be successful off in the West. And then lastly, and one of the biggest ones, is going to be the Battle of Antietam. So this is Robert E. Lee's first attempt to really go outside of the United States up into Maryland and just try and do some damage to the U.S. However, General McClellan actually is able to stop Robert E. Lee, and there's really no clear victor at the end of this. It's the bloodiest single day of combat in U.S. history. About 20,000 people die during this day of fighting. But at the end of it, Lincoln is going to declare it essentially a U.S. victory, because the South, the Confederacy, does have to end up retreating because of such heavy losses of life and heavy losses of troops. So, what is the effect of the Battle of Antietam, and why is it so significant? Well, the Battle of Antietam is going to convince Britain and also France not to support the Confederacy during the war. And it's not necessarily because the South lost that battle, it's because of what results out of that loss, or really what comes out of that U.S. victory. Because at this point, once this victory is official, Lincoln is going to release his Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll really talk in depth more tomorrow. But essentially what it does is it emancipates all of the slaves in the states that are currently in rebellion against the United States. So essentially all Confederate states. Lincoln says, all right, if you have slaves, they're free now. But anyway, that's enough for today. We're going to continue the rest of this tomorrow. So the second half of the Civil War will be tomorrow.